Welcome to the Paul Christopher Show. This is Paul Christopher. There is a struggle in the world today. A conflict older than history. It's a competition of ideas and their proponents. It's about who is right and who is wrong and how major decisions are being made. But is it really? And how can we change this dynamic? During the COVID-19 pandemic of 2019 to 2022, government distrust has led to election fraud accusations and demonstrations, vaccination mandate protests, and anti-mask movements, calling government's response to public health crises into question. The results of the 2020 presidential election were marred by allegations of fraud, leading up to the January 6, 2021 breach of the Capitol building by protesters. They were attempting to halt the counting of presidential election results. The count was disrupted by pro-Trump followers who broke into the building, forcing members of Congress to flee.
While we're here, we might as well set up a government. Hey, let's take a seat, people! Let's take a seat!
This delayed the certification of the election results to the morning of Thursday, the 7th of January, instead of the 6th as planned. The box containing the Electoral College certificates had to be moved and secured in order to prevent the results of the election from literally being stolen. By the end of the day, 5 people were dead. A Capitol police officer who was beaten by rioters and sprayed in the face with a bear deterrent, an Air Force veteran who was shot by police when climbing through a broken door, and 3 people who died in medical emergencies during the day. 1 man due to a fatal heart attack, a woman who was crushed to death after being trampled on by demonstrators, and a stroke victim. What is going on in America? Is this something new or an old phenomenon that has simply increased in its intensity?
Well, guess what? America showed up!
Where's the rest of everybody? There's not enough of us. They're going to bring the vets in or something.
Those were the sounds from inside our nation's capital, recorded on January 6, 2021. How did distrust of the U.S. presidential election result in lawlessness, trespassing, and assault, not to mention highly threatening behavior? To find the answers, we'll be taking a trip back in time to the Colonial era, moving through the early crises of our young American nation and leading up to the secession of the Confederate States. We'll discover that the very same themes playing out today created distrust in the past, which led to the birth of a new nation and war. It is clear that distrust of the government is rising in the U.S., and I hope that you enjoy this walk down memory lane to identify some of the causes. As always, let's start with the basics. What is government distrust defined as? Well, government, according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, Definition 5A, is the organization, machinery, or agency through which a political unit exercises authority and performs functions, and which is usually classified according to the distribution of power within it. Distrust means the lack or absence of trust, and political means of or relating to government. Government distrust, then, is the lack or absence of trust in the organization, machinery, or agency in which a political unit exercises authority and performs its functions. I think that this definition is precisely what we need to discuss today. There is a significant amount of distrust in the government among Americans, broadly through the office of the president, the Congress, courts, and all political units where they exercise authority and perform functions. What I will show in this 3-part series is that distrust in government has been around longer than our republic, and that fraud, bribery, and scandals are nothing new. Let's take a look at the issues from a historical context, beginning with colonial times through to today. Part 1. Colonial America. Distrust created by unfair policies and taxes designed to extract value from one group and give to another. The purpose of the American colonies from their onset was to enrich mercantilist England. In 1651 and 1660, the English Parliament wanted to increase revenues and passed the Navigation Acts. The acts required that goods from America that were to be shipped to England or to other colonies would be transported solely upon English or colonial ships. The main competitive target at the time was the Dutch. Certain goods, such as tobacco, sugar, and cotton, were to be solely traded with England, leaving out more competitive buyers. This severely impacted growers and merchants, since England could not absorb all the exports that were being produced. The Navigation Acts were extremely unpopular, as colonial farmers would earn far less for their crops and other raw materials than they would gain in open markets. The response from the colonial merchants was to smuggle goods to other markets, such as Dutch colonies, so that more attractive prices could be gained for their goods. Ships and cargo ran the risk of being confiscated by the British Navy, but fortunately it was far too costly for the Navy to enforce the acts, and smuggling was largely ignored up until 1776. The colonists at that time did not view smuggling as a crime, and typically sailed with duplicated paperwork and charted courses to avoid patrols. In 1763, after a resounding victory for Great Britain, the 7 Years' War, or French and Indian War, as it is also known, left England in debt. To help pay it off, Parliament enacted new taxes on the colonies, designed to reimburse England for costs incurred during the war. These new taxes include the Stamp Act of 1765, a tax on all official documents and papers, and the Townshend Act, which went into effect in November 1767. The Townshend Act consisted of duties on certain imported goods that the British didn't think the colonists could make, such as English china, lead, glass, and tea. Even though the tax rate for the colonists at the time equaled 1/20th of those paid by their counterparts in England, the Americans protested vehemently against the taxes and either refused to drink British tea or instead chose illegally imported Dutch tea. The mounting effects of the boycott of English tea and smuggling hurt the East India Company. After years of colonial protests, culminating in the Boston Massacre of March 1770, most of the taxes included in the Townshend Act were repealed by Parliament in April 1770, except for the tax on imported tea. The Tea Act was a symbolic gesture showing that Parliament had retained the authority to tax the colonies. The Tea Act was intended to force the colonists to buy tea only from the East India Company. Protests continued, arguing the unfairness of taxation without representation. Led by Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty, men boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor on December 16, 1773, the Dartmouth, the Beaver, and the Eleanor, 2 of which were Nantucket Quaker-owned ships, and 1 was owned by a Bostonian. Ineptly disguised as Native American tribesmen, they split open casks of East India Company tea with tomahawks and dumped 45 tons of it, valued at $1 million in today's money, into the harbor. Young boys joined the festivities by climbing on the mounds of tea and pushing them over to be sure that the sea water spoiled all of it. Parliament back in England was outraged by the actions of the colonists. In retaliation, it passed the Coercive Acts, which included the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Governing Act, the Act for the Impartial Administration of Justice, and the Quartering Act. Not intended by Parliament to be punitive, the Quebec Act further inflamed colonist sentiments against England. I will review each act briefly. The Boston Port Act closed the port of Boston to all commercial trade, but allowed supplies to British forces and necessary items for the colonists such as fuel and food. Thomas Paine used the suffering of Bostonians, including starvation or abandoning of their homes to the British, as cause for American independence. The Boston Port Act damaged the economy of Boston, causing the loss of trade and unemployment. The Massachusetts Governing Act removed the representative government of Massachusetts and put in place a council whose members had to be approved by the governor. Essentially, the governor would handpick the council. Judges and sheriffs could be appointed without the council's approval, and sheriffs could appoint jurors, making the entire judicial system completely unfair. The Act for the Impartial Administration of Justice enabled the governor in Massachusetts to send individuals for trial to Great Britain or another colony where they were sure to be convicted. The right of habeas corpus had been revoked, as was the right to a trial by peers, inalienable rights guaranteed under the Magna Carta in 1297. The Quartering Act forced colonists to house British soldiers in uninhabited barns or houses at the expense of the colonists. This practice infuriated Americans. The Quebec Act increased negative sentiment towards Parliament, but its passage was not directly linked to the Boston Tea Party. The act extended the southern border of Quebec down to the Ohio River, granted religious freedoms to Canadian Catholics, reinstated French civil law, especially the seigneurial system, which enabled a feudal system style of land grants, by a privileged class, the seigneurs, and changed the loyalty oath to make it easier for Catholics to take positions in the government. The colonists feared that Parliament could make similar changes in the American colonies, further eroding their inalienable rights. In conclusion, the Coercive Acts were designed to punish and control the colonists, but ultimately they accelerated talk of rebellion and precipitated the revolution. The Quebec Act was viewed as a projection of Parliament's power, stripping away the colonists' inalienable rights, removing the checks and balances of government, taking away habeas corpus, the right to a trial by jury of peers, and other punitive measures are sure to create distrust, ultimately leading to the War of Independence. The Boston Tea Party still resonates today as an appropriate response to unfairness. Power concentrated in one person or branch of government without balance leads to unrest and revolt. This reverberates through to modern times, where governors in states like New York and New Jersey were heavily criticized for using their emergency powers to shut down businesses, force assisted living homes to accept COVID-positive patients, and effectively lock people in their homes in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Nullification, creating distrust through challenges to federal laws and authority. The year is 1798 in post-colonial independent America. Federalism is on the rise. French officials are demanding bribes in what has become known as the XYZ affair, sparking a naval conflict with France, and the concept of nullification is introduced by two of the framers of the Constitution. President John Adams and the Federalists had come to believe that a strong federal government was necessary to the survival of the Republic. The Adams presidency and Federalists in Congress began to enact policies that expanded the federal government's powers. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison held that the federal government had no right to powers that had not been delegated to it under the Constitution. If the federal government assumed such powers, then the states had the right to declare them unconstitutional and invalid. This was due to the belief that the Constitution was a compact among the states, and the fact that the judicial review system was not yet well developed. The Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 were highly controversial and labeled unconstitutional by some. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson argued that the states had the right and duty to declare them so. The Alien Acts gave power to the government to deport foreigners and make it harder for them to vote. This was mainly aimed at French and Irish immigrants who were mostly pro-French. The Sedition Act effectively prohibited public protest against the government. Newspapers could not publish articles critical of the government. It was a clear violation of the First Amendment of the Constitution. In response, Kentucky and Virginia passed resolutions that rejected the acts and declared them invalid in their states. The resolutions were secretly written by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, two of the original framers of the Constitution. Some other states did not agree and believed that such powers to determine what rights the federal government was granted under the Constitution was to be determined by the judiciary. Regardless, with the threat of war and the Republican Democratic Party winning control of the federal government in 1800, most of the acts either expired or were appealed, except for the Alien Enemy Act, which was expanded to include women in 1918, and provides the federal government with the power to deport aliens from a country with which the United States is at war. All told, there were 25 prosecutions of the Alien Act, resulting in 10 convictions. This, however, led to the Nullification Crisis of 1832 to 1833. After the War of 1812 and the Napoleonic Wars, British manufacturers began to offer goods at prices that American producers could not match. The northeastern states wanted the Tariff Act because, as manufacturers, their economies were negatively impacted by low-cost foreign goods and raw materials. In response, Congress passed the Tariff Act of 1828, raising tariffs on imported goods to 38% and 45% on imported raw materials. In December 1828, John C. Calhoun anonymously published a pamphlet entitled South Carolina Exposition and Protest, which argued for nullification of the tariffs and secession of South Carolina. As a primarily agrarian state, it relied on imports for manufactured goods and certain raw materials, and would be unfairly impacted by the Tariff Acts. The executive branch was split, with Vice President John C. Calhoun